going to show you my workflow for rapid prototyping. Being able to build an app quickly is one of the best use cases for AI right now. So I'm going to show you how I do it. It's not all AI based, and that's part of what makes it so fast, is identifying which parts of the app you want to outsource to AI and which parts you want to do yourself. This is how I built a mobile app in a few days, going from nothing but the idea to a working app that I can now use on my phone. Let's dive into it. So to start with, the first step was to have an idea. I wanted to build an app that was going to let me take voice notes and transcribe those notes into text and then format those notes using an LLM. So essentially a voice memo app where you speak, and you can speak for a long time. And once it's done, then you get a really nicely formatted transcript, because the transcriber turns your audio into text, and then on LLM will take it and it'll turn it into multiple paragraphs and it'll reformat it so that it's very readable. This is what I wanted. So based on this product idea, there are a few requirements that came out immediately obvious. The first one, most important, was that it was going to have to run on mobile. That's because when I take voice notes, I want to be able to do it on my phone, not sitting on my computer. But it could not be a web app, unfortunately. The problem with web apps in this case is that, as far as I know, there's no way to keep the recording on when the screen goes off. So that was the starting point. I knew this had to be a mobile app. So with that in mind, with the idea that this is going to be a mobile app, first and foremost, I got started on the mockup. This was the next step, is to turn these ideas in my head into something a little more concrete. So I'm going to jump into FigJam over here. I'm going to open FigJam, and I start making mockups. We'll start over here. I thought, all right, I'm going to have a list of threads, and each of these is going to be essentially a voice memo, a voice note. You speak and you get a new thread, and you're going to get a list of them. They'll be grouped by date, and there'll be a search box, etc. There's going to be some controls to show you the list, to go to settings, to create a new one of these threads. And I also made a secondary mockup, which is the one I ended up using down here, which is slightly different. I didn't want the bottom bar. So I have this list UI, and I had some ideas about where the controls were going to be, what was going to go in the actual list items. For instance, it'll just be a title. I was not planning to put any date information in here. All of these will be grouped by date, but it's not going to show up on each individual list item. So this is getting a little bit more concrete than just this idea in my head. And when you click into one of these arrows are actually a bit wrong. When you click into any of these, it's going to go to a detail view for one of these threads. And it's going to have at least one message, like we have here. And it might have more because you can add to threads. There's a text box. You can add some text. There's a record button. You can also record. And so given these controls, you can do one of two things. You can add text, which is going to look like this. It's going to open up a text box that you can type in with the keyboard. And you can hit create to save. Or you can go add a recording, which is going to open up some sort of UI that allows you to record. And in this case is just showing you a duration and some sort of animation. Show you that it's recording along with the cancel and save buttons. That was the idea. So that's pretty simple, right? There's not a lot going on here, but putting it into FigJam or putting it into any wireframing tool, just doing it on paper, helps you crystallize your thinking. And that's what I wanted to do here. It also let me make a few notes about how the UX is going to be. And then I have sort of a mood board over here, which is, I like the Grok app, the app from X.AI. I like their dark mode anyways. I just took a few screenshots and plopped it in here as sort of some style that I like in case I have the chance to use this later. Because naturally, this is not designed at all. It's not at all clear what this is going to look like in pixel terms. But Grok gave me some inspiration. And now that I had my mood board, I have these mockups of the user flows. Then I went and mocked out the schema, and I created the schema. This is the rough idea. What data am I actually going to need to save? So from the beginning, I wanted to have the idea of users, and that's because I wanted all of this to sync. So if I have a different phone, or I have multiple phones, or I have a phone and a computer, etc., I want to be able to get all my data on all those devices, just like many apps you would use on the App Store. So I knew I was going to need this concept of a user that was going to tie all of your data together to some record. Then along with users, I was going to have a profile. And this is partially to do with the database that I ended up using, which I will talk about in a moment. But I needed to have a secondary piece of data because I cannot modify the users table directly. So I have this idea of a profile, sure, and there's a one-to-one relationship with users and profiles. Then the rest of this is pretty straightforward. Every profile has a one-to-many relationship with threads. So every profile has many threads. Then every thread has many messages. And every message has 1 or 0 recordings. It has a one-to-one relationship with recordings, and it is nullable. So maybe you have a recording, maybe you don't. And each recording will have a file. And that's to reflect the fact that you can add, you see over here, you can add recordings or you can add text messages to each thread. The recordings get transcribed into text. And then I had this idea for jobs, or rather I was thinking, well, how are we going to actually do the LLM formatting, LLM processing? Because that's going to be a server-side job. I need an API key in there somewhere. And I don't want to put my API key in the app itself in the client. Part of the impetus for creating a schema at this stage was to clarify my thinking about the UI. Here we have the various screens which influence the data. And I wanted to get a clear sense in my head of exactly what data we're going to have in the database. So sometimes if you do this sort of schema mockup, you will see that you need more data than you expected. Like in my case, I hadn't really thought about recordings going in. I just thought we're going to have threads that are going to have many messages, etc. But by thinking at this stage, I was able to quickly clarify what all the tables are that I'm going to need. So with this mockup in hand, this whole process probably took about 30 minutes, maybe an hour. I don't remember at this point, but it's all pretty quick. Just drawing rectangles and thinking through what the data is going to look like. At this point, I wanted to get initial version of the UI out. So to do that, I jumped into V0, and you can see the prompt that I used initially here. Curious, you can pause the video and look at it. But basically, I just told it what I wanted for the initial 2 screens. I thought if I'm going to have V0 build every screen, it might be a little too much for V0. Maybe that's not the case. This was my first time using V0, so perhaps it's more capable than I thought. But regardless, I wanted to just give it this test with 2 screens and not 1 screen because I was going to need navigation somehow. So I wanted V0 to handle that, to understand that there's going to be navigation. So in addition to my description, I gave it 2 images, which I just took from FigJam screenshots. I wanted the recording screen and I wanted the threads screen, the list. So I asked it to go at it and it did, and it spit out a bunch of code. And once it was done, because you cannot preview React Native in V0, then grabbed the code and I needed to put it somewhere. I knew I was going to put it in a code base. So I first had to get a code base going. The next step was to create a project, which is pretty simple. I just went to the Expo website. Expo is a framework for React Native that I had heard about before. I hadn't built with this, but I figured I'll start with the framework. I've heard good things. I've heard the developer experience is nice, so I'll go ahead and use that. So I went and grabbed the command. I initialized a project, and that was that. Then I have an initial app. I had to poke around a bit to understand how the views work. So there was a bit of a learning curve, very slight, but I wasn't sure immediately how things like the router work in Expo. So I had to poke around a bit, see where I was going to actually put my code. And then at that point, I went back to V0, grabbed the code, dropped it into the code base and ran it. And then we had an app that would actually run. Also in choosing Expo, I made sure not to use anything like a other template or any additional options. I didn't try to add Tailwind for my native project, for instance, because I knew, or I know from experience, that these sorts of projects often have build issues. You might be able to run it in development and you get going and you're going really fast and everything's going great. And then you try to build it for production, or in this case, you try to build it to run on your phone and everything would break. That was what I wanted to avoid. So at that point, I dropped into Cursor where I'd put the code and I started asking about how this whole Expo thing works. I just wanted to get some information to handle some routing. It showed me very nicely that there was this presentation modal, which is exactly what I wanted for my application. And so I was off to the races. And essentially, I just had it going and making various changes to get through the different screens in my application. At this point, I was not using V0 because I wanted it to just happen in my code base. I didn't want to do any more copy and pasting. So I was using Cursor for this. And when I was doing this, I just asked it to go screen by screen based on my mockups here, and I had it create the list. I had it create this button over here that led to the record view or the text view. And I had it mock out some data and create these initial thread entry items. At that point, I even had a work in progress video that I made for myself showing where we're at. And you can see the UI over here on the right in this video. The UI in the list here was essentially what came out of V0. So I was pretty impressed, not because it looks like anything special, but because it looks fine. It is totally usable. When you're just going for an MVP and you want to get a list out, and you need that list to work well. V0 was able to correctly use the components that I wanted. It was able to use React Native components that handle things like smooth list rendering. So I was very happy with V0. And then once I got into Cursor, I was very happy with Cursor too. All the other screens were created by Cursor using their agent system and Claude 3.7. So I mentioned earlier in the video, one of the important things if you want to do rapid prototyping is deciding what not to have the AI do. So in this case, the big decision was not to have the AI do any of the backend. All the data modeling, all the permissions, all of that is going to be handled for us. So to do that, I turned to InstantDB because this project, their claim to fame is that all the interactions are really fast, meaning it's really well suited to native apps, because in a native app, you want things to happen immediately. You don't want to be waiting around. You don't want your users to be waiting around. As soon as you click something, you expect it to happen. And on top of that, it has sync. So it takes care of syncing information between clients once you're logged in. It has real-time updates. It has permissions. It has a lot of the stuff that you would want in a native app, in a mobile app, and it's all done for you. So that was the idea. Do none of this on my own and don't have the AI do it either, because in my experience, the AI can make subtle mistakes. And those subtle mistakes are less subtle when they're in UI code. You can just look at it and you think, well, that's not right. That's not how I want it. The subtle mistakes in the backend code are much more pernicious. But if you're building a prototype, I am advocating that you try to save as much of your time as possible. You try to move as fast as possible. And part of that means avoiding long code reviews. So the best way to avoid AI code reviews is to not have the AI write the code in the first place. At this point, we had the app running in roughly the state that I'm going to show you right here. We'll load up the app in Expo, and it drops us into the sign-in screen. Apple and Google sign-in don't work on the simulator, unfortunately, but that's why we have email sign-in. So here we have the local app running in the simulator. You see that we got logged in. You can create text notes. We added those notes. And we can do recordings as well, which will get processed on the back end and get nicely formatted. Although in the case of a really short recording like this one, there's probably not going to be any separation in the paragraphs. You can see what's going on in the records as well. So there you have it. At this point, the app was pretty much done from an MVP perspective. The last thing to do was another thing that I have not yet been able to outsource successfully to the AI, which is the icon design. For the icon design, Expo is nice enough to provide a Figma template that lets you create some designs and see how they'll look on a phone. And so that's what I did. I used the tried and true method of drawing rectangles with rounded corners and adding gradients. And there we go. Now we have a logo. Exported that, put it into Expo, and then we were done. So that was the whole process, start to finish, building an app that is now on App Store Connect. It has not yet been approved for the App Store, but that generally takes longer. And it's not something that you can speed up on your own. The most important thing here is how do you get things done really quickly? To reiterate the learnings from this project, number one, start with a mockup to clarify your own thinking and design your data model as well. From there, let the AI get an initial version of the UI out the door. In this case, I used V0 to do that. Then the next step, when you're ready to build the app more seriously, choose a backend so that you don't have to do it yourself. And also you don't let the AI do that. And then the final step, if you want to, is to go and use your own design skills, because the AI is not yet good at creating icons, unfortunately. Although if you know of any good products for creating icons, I'd love to know. In my experience using OpenAI specifically, it generates really complex icons that do not look good on a phone. They don't look good at small sizes. They don't look good as favicons. They are just too complex. I have yet to be able to get OpenAI to generate a more simple icon like those that you expect. For instance, an Apple style icon. These are all pretty simple, right? The settings icon is maybe the most complex, but the wallet, the app store, TV, news, these are all the kind of things that you would expect from an app icon, and OpenAI does not like to make icons so simple. That's all. If you have had other experience building rapid prototypes with AI, I'd love to hear about it. I would love to improve my workflow, and hopefully these tips will help you improve yours. So let me know in the comments if there's anything that you would recommend or any issues you've come across when trying to build this type of app. That's all for now. See ya.